So up to this point, we've seen that pretty much everyone has a mixed economic system. And given that there's a consensus that planned economies aren't necessarily what we want, as that we mostly agree that governments have to do something, so we're not going to have a pure market economy, the question becomes, what policies should we have? Should be the basis of our economic policies? And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Now, back in the olden days, and for economics, the 1800s will qualify, pretty much everyone was a classical economist. Okay, they didn't call it classical economics at the time, not until much later. But for classical economics, the idea is that the government shouldn't get involved. They can only make things worse. Okay, in classical economics, the emphasis was on analyzing individual markets, supply and demand, not the entire economy as an aggregate, as a whole, and that economic downturns would be resolved eventually on their own by prices returning closer or going back to equilibrium. Now, that was pretty much the consensus right up until the year 1929. And in the year 1929, we had that great stock market crash that ushered in the period known as the Great Depression. Now, we had a recession, but it didn't seem to be getting better. And even though no one really disagreed that the economy, wouldn't get better eventually, the question for one economist, John Maynard Keynes, was how long is it going to take? Okay, maybe the economy will come back to equilibrium, will recover in the long run, but in his words, in the long run, we're all dead. Okay, in his opinion, just because the economy would come back in the long run didn't mean that in the short term people weren't going to suffer and quite possibly overthrow capitalism, which at the time seemed like a very real possibility. So Keynes thought the government had to do something, even if it wasn't going to make the economy better necessarily, but to keep people satisfied from a political standpoint. But he also engaged in a lot of very important economic analysis that was also very new. So for Keynes, a basic question was, we have all this unused labor, right, unemployment, and we have all this unused physical capital, like factories that aren't producing at full capacity or maybe are even not being used at all. And why can't these things be mashed up? It seems irrational for them not to be mashed up. In other words, why can't we reach productive capacity? What's going wrong that all these things are just lying dormant when they don't have to? It just seemed irrational. Keynes' answer was his theory of the business cycle, which is that there are periods of normal growth punctuated by periods of irrational caution, during which households stop spending and start saving, figuring that things are going to be bad, but they're the ones who are really causing the problem in the first place by their irrational caution. The result of this irrational caution and this increased savings on the part of households is that their spending goes down, so there's less money going to firms in exchange for products. And if there's less money going to firms in exchange for products, then those firms have to lay people off. But the more people they lay off, the more households get spooked and start saving, just in case they get laid off. And the problem just gets worse and worse, and that's where those recessions come from. Hopefully you can see what I mean here in what's called a circular flow diagram. So on one side you have households, and on the other side you have firms. And the households spend their money, so you can see that red line, that red arrow. They spend money in exchange for goods and services. So money flows to businesses, and goods and services flow to households. But the households get that money by sending inputs, in other words, factors of production, especially labor, to businesses in exchange for money in the form of salaries. So businesses change those inputs to goods and services, through manufacturing, and they send them to households in exchange for money. So in the red circle, you have the monetary flow, and in the blue circle, you have the physical flow of goods and services on the bottom and inputs on the top. So according to Keynes, less money is coming from households to businesses and because of their irrational caution. And if that's happening, then less money can flow from businesses to households. So in other words, some of the money that would be flowing around this is getting siphoned off to savings. And so that's why you will hear Keynesian economists say things like, savings is destruction. Another really important analytical tool that Keynes began using was the idea of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Before, classical economics only looked at supply and demand for individual markets. But Keynes revolutionized things by suggesting that we could analyze the supply of everything in the market altogether and the demand of the entire economy altogether. That's what aggregate means, everything sort of added together. Okay, so instead of quantity, we have GDP, which is all production in the economy. And instead of price, because of course everything doesn't have just one price, we have price level. And if your intuition tells you that an increase in the price level is the same as inflation, your intuition is absolutely correct. And if the price level went down, that would be deflation. And since growth is an increase in GDP, what we want to do is see both aggregate demand and aggregate supply constantly moving to the right. But for Keynes, a downturn meant that aggregate demand was going down. People were spending less money. So for him, the solution is how to push aggregate demand back up. Okay, how to push it to the right, that entire curve. Remember, when we say demand goes up, we're saying the entire curve moves. So for him, that was the question. How do we push aggregate demand to the right? How do we increase aggregate demand? How do we get spending levels to go up? And that's why you'll hear Keynesian economics referred to sometimes as demand-side economics. So John Maynard Keynes' basic idea was that in order to solve an economic downturn, government needed to do something to increase spending. And in particular, they were going to have to lower taxes to some degree, because lower taxes meant more money in people's pockets and more money to spend. But the primary thing they would have to do, because people were not likely to spend because they were not in a spending mood, is the government would have to step in and spend a bunch of money. Now, the good news to Keynes was that all this new government spending didn't need to actually match the amount of missing spending as a result of the downturn. In fact, government would only have to spend a small portion of that in order to cause a lot more spending in the economy as a whole because of what he called the multiplier effect. In other words, if government spends, say, $1 billion, then $1 billion goes into people's pockets, the people who produce the goods and services that the government purchased. Those people would in turn spend maybe 90% of that money on other things, and then 90% of that money would get spent on other things, so that all the money the government spent would be multiplied, maybe 7 times over, so that $1 billion of government spending would create $7 billion total in spending in the economy. And in this way, government could push aggregate demand back up to pre-recession levels and fix everything. This is basically what Franklin Roosevelt was trying to do during the New Deal, trying to solve the Great Depression through demand-side Keynesian economics. And the Great Depression lasted for a long time. So there are people who disagree about whether or not that was successful. But at least there wasn't a communist revolution, right? So some people will just point at that and say, well, look, the New Deal was successful at least in those terms. But at the end of the New Deal, we had World War II. And World War II, to a lot of people, gave us sort of a hard reset on the economy, okay? Because we had this wartime economy where government was spending a lot, producing planes and tanks and things like that. That aggregate demand, that increased aggregate demand drastically, and therefore fixed the economy. So a lot of people think World War II basically got us out of the Great Depression and proved Keynes correct. So far we have classical economics, which has the basic idea that government shouldn't get involved, and Keynesian economics, which basically believes that government should get involved by raising aggregate demand. Okay, but a third thing I'm going to talk about is supply-side economics, which is basically what it sounds like. Given that demand-side economics was about boosting aggregate demand, supply-side economists go back to that aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, that chart, and they suggest that rather than pushing aggregate demand up, government should try to push aggregate supply up. A central part of supply-side economics is what's known as the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer was a prominent economist, and the Laffer curve is not scientifically derived. It's something that he originally wrote on a napkin, but it's just meant to illustrate a principle. And that principle is this. If you tax 0% of income, if your tax rate is 0%, you will collect $0. But if your tax rate is 100%, you're going to collect $0 because no one will have any incentive to work. Okay, so the total amount of income everybody will earn is 0, because who cares about earning anything if it's all going to be taxed away, and 100% of 0 is still 0. So there must be some tax rate in between 0 and 100% that is sort of the best tax rate for getting the most amount of money. The upshot of this idea is, as you take a look at this curve, that there must be some tax rate that's so high that you can actually decrease taxes and get more in tax revenues. And the reason for that is that more and more people will go to work because they have an incentive to go to work, because they get to keep more of their money if taxes are lower. Now that's probably a much better point when taxes, or the top marginal tax rate, is 90% of income, the way it was throughout the 40s and 50s. So the first big supply-side tax cutter, it turns out, was actually John F. Kennedy, who, due to an economic downturn, his counselors advised him to decrease taxes. So they did. They lowered the top marginal tax rate to 70%, which of course to us still seems really high, because in the 1980s, a more famous tax-cutting president, Ronald Reagan, chopped the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%, and there was a lower rate for lower incomes of 14%. And we've since raised that up to 35 and above, the top marginal tax rate. But the idea was that they could lower taxes and actually lure people into work, because they would have more of an incentive to work. And the more people working, the higher aggregate supply is going to be, and therefore, as you can hopefully go back to that graph and see, higher aggregate supply is going to mean a higher real GDP, and therefore economic growth. So with one major exception that I'm going to talk about in the next unit, these are the three major theories of economic policy making. Classical economics, which states that government really shouldn't get involved and doesn't believe in sort of looking at the economy as a whole, because there are pitfalls of doing that. Keynesian economics, which basically looks at aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and believes that economic downturns are a result of decreased spending, and that government needs to get involved to boost that spending back up, to boost aggregate demand back up. So that's why it's also called demand-side economics. And then we have supply-side economics, which is the belief that tax cuts can be used to boost aggregate supply rather than aggregate demand, and thereby boost the economy.